Jack the Ripper is probably one of the greatest unsolved murder mysteries of all time. And here you have this unsolved mystery that for 100 years has been unsolved to this day, and there's not really been any breakthroughs. And I've investigated this case very thoroughly, and I found some very interesting things that made me come up with a brand new theory about who Jack the Ripper may actually be. Now, not much is known about Jack the Ripper himself, but what we do know is that the witnesses reported only that he wore a black cape and a black hat. They have no physical attributes, no body type. They don't even know if it's male or female. It's just that people who were in the area that when these murders occurred, happened to notice a man with, a person with a black cape and a black hat. And that's about as much of a description as we have of Jack the Ripper. Now, with that being said, we don't really know what Jack the Ripper looks like. We don't even know if he's technically a man. Could he be could Jack the Ripper be a female? Could Jack the Ripper be a woman? And that's something that I find interesting, that I think could be a possibility, because when you look at the evidence surrounding the Jack the Ripper case, all the victims had their reproductive organs removed from their bodies. And usually when that occurs with a murder, it's pertaining to something to do with pregnancy, with birth. And usually it involves a female who has some sort of animosity or anger towards a pregnancy or birth. And so every single victim of Jack the Ripper had their female reproductive organs removed from their bodies. So to me, this sounds more like an angry woman who possibly, was a member of society in a wealthy family, and perhaps she couldn't give birth to a child. Perhaps she was barren. Maybe she even had a miscarriage, and her husband had cheated on her with a prostitute, and this caused sort of this animosity towards these prostitutes, and perhaps he had a child with one of these prostitutes, and that angered this wife of nobility and society, and she wanted to seek vengeance by taking it out on these prostitutes. And it's funny, when we think Jack the Ripper, we always think of it as being a man, but in that time, because of sexism, unfortunately, women were never suspected of being serial killers. It was believed that they were too weak to commit such crimes, and that they often overlooked females or women as being potential suspects. And unfortunately, that's the way it was. And if you look through history, right, there's a lot of notable men serial killers, but there's not a lot of female serial killers, prolific ones that have made headlines, right? And that is primarily because there was sexism, that occurred, throughout history, where it was a male-dominated society, and they didn't think that a woman was capable of such atrocities. And so often these cases, they would suspect a man before they would ever suspect a woman. And so for a woman in England, in the 19th century, this would have been perfect cover. They would have been able to commit these murders and never once been suspected. And especially if they were from a family of notoriety and they were way up in society, they would have never suspected this woman of committing such atrocities. So she would have got away with it scot-free. And so it's very possible the reason they never solved Jack the Ripper's case is because it was not a man, it was a female, and that they have been looking all these years in the wrong direction. And so is it time to rethink this case and start thinking potentially that a female could have been Jack the Ripper? Now, there's one specific person that I view as a potential suspect that I think more than likely could have been Jack the Ripper, as crazy as it sounds. So there is another prolific female serial killer in history that we know about, and that would be Lizzie Borden of Fall Rivers, Massachusetts, who took an axe and murdered both her parents. Now, what's interesting about Lizzie Borden is that, the style in which she killed her parents was actually replicated in another murder case all the way in Vasculla, Iowa, with the Vasculla Axe murders, right? In which a suspect, snuck into this family's home in Vasculla, Iowa, and murdered this family of 8 in their sleep, in their home, and they never found the killer. And what's interesting is that it almost happened exactly the same as the Lizzie Borden murders, and that it's so eerily similar, one could speculate that, is it possible that Lizzie Borden was the Vasculla Axe murderer? And so, looking at the timeline, okay, now the Vasculla Axe murders occurred in 1883, and so Lizzie Borden was born in 1860. So she would have been about 23 around that time, okay? And what's interesting about serial killers is that there's usually this pattern of them killing people, that there's not just one victim or 2 victims. There's this history of them committing these atrocities, okay? So I don't think that if Lizzie Borden committed the crimes, if she killed her parents, that this was the only time she did it. Perhaps she had done it before in the past in Vasculla, Iowa, which she frequently visited Iowa as a younger woman, okay? So it's more than possible she would have committed these crimes there in Iowa and then went back to her home in Fall Rivers, Massachusetts, which was far away from Iowa. They would have never suspected a woman to be the murderer, and she would have got away with it scot-free. And having these tendencies, it's possible that her parents had angered her. And some believe that Lizzie Borden may have been barren and that she had this great anger because of it. Other people believe she had a boyfriend who was discovered around the home at the time of the murders, and that she had a child with this boyfriend, and that her parents had forced her to give up the child or abort the child, and this made her have this anger towards her parents, and this is why she committed these murders. And what's interesting is during Lizzie Borden's life, she would have been about 52 years old when Jack the Ripper was prevalent in England and these murders took place. And Lizzie Borden happened to be in England around the same time that these murders occurred. So did Lizzie Borden potentially go to England? Because we know the last part of Lizzie Borden's life, she was non-existent. No one really heard from her. She was very dormant. She didn't speak to anyone, but she was proven innocent as far as we know, and then wasn't heard of anymore. And she kind of kept a secluded life. And I think she knew here in America she was well known. Her name had traveled across the country, so it would be very suspicious if they had found her in the area of murders occurring. But in England, it would have been much different. And perhaps she had traveled to England and continued this pattern of being a serial killer. And so we have to wonder, are all these events connected? And, you know, what's interesting is you can find a lot of similarities with all these cases. And it starts to make you wonder, was Jack the Ripper a female? And was it possibly Lizzie Borden? This is something that I presented as a theory that I believe if we start looking in the direction of Jack the Ripper being a female, perhaps we might solve this case.